89.9 The Light. You're in conversation with Clayton, and it is so good to be able to cross over the ditch to New Zealand right now. And we're doing it via the beauty and the wonder of Zoom to chat to the content director at Rima New Zealand. Now, this is, I suppose, the best way to describe this, one of our sister stations over in New Zealand, doing very similar work over there. Luke Weston is the man in question. G'day, Luke.
Hey, Clayton, how are you?
I am doing very well, thank you. You do head up a remarkable organisation through the whole content area, and you broadcast both radio and TV all over New Zealand, right?
Yeah, that's right. We're a national network. It's a bit of a smaller country than Australia, so we can do it probably more easily. But I think 128 transmission sites for 3 radio networks and a Christian TV channel as well is basically what we do here.
There you go. And Luke heads up all of the content that's happening across those areas as he moves forward. Luke, we got you on because you're going to be effectively, in a way, sort of a New Zealand correspondent for us. There's been a couple of big things happening that have interacted with both Australia and New Zealand. We're going to get to the travel bubble in just a second and how you guys have been coping with COVID. But let's start by the fact that you have re-elected your Prime Minister this week, and indeed you work a very similar system to us. So it's not actually people voting for the Prime Minister, it's the local people and that sort of thing. They choose it. But it was quite a big win for Jacinda Ardern and her party.
Yeah, that's right. And it was really an unknown thing. I mean, she had been polling very well. She's been very popular. She's not everybody's cup of tea, and which politician is. But certainly there was this feeling, I think, that New Zealand had fared perhaps better than the rest of the world, or many places in the world, when it came to COVID-19. Jacinda Ardern also is a very compassionate, very personable leader. No matter who you are, I think you can kind of see that in her. And so when the mosque attacks happened, and that was a little while ago in New Zealand, it's just a horrible, horrible event. But Jacinda Ardern, was lauded across the world for handling that in a very compassionate way. And I think that all of that were on the minds of New Zealanders when they went to the polls. And, you mentioned in your intro, Clay, that people don't vote for, leaders. But I think in this instance, the fact that our Labour government has romped in with their biggest victory for 50 years actually probably is an indication of the fact that they have this leader in Jacinda Ardern that really resonated with the majority of New Zealand voters.
Yeah. Look, my question was actually going to be a bit around her as well, that, outside of New Zealand, it seems like she's just talked about around the world as this remarkable person and leading so well. She's a young mum, actually had a child in office as well, which is quite unusual, and, still very young in terms of what politicians normally are. Is that the way that New Zealanders sort of look at her as well? It seems like, she almost can do no wrong for the rest of the world.
Well, she's my age. She's 39 years old. It always makes me feel like I should have done more with my life, to be honest. My wife likes reminding me that as well. See, she's your age. She's Prime Minister. No, I think she, she's handled some situations very, very well. She hasn't obviously, got fans across the spectrum, and there are people that feel appalled that she's the Prime Minister. And when you look at the results, Labour got 49% of the vote. It's enough to get 65 seats out of 120 in our parliament, which is the majority, which means that they can govern alone. And we've got something called an MMP system, like you said, relatively similar to yours. So they're going to have a huge sea of red seats that they're going to be able to do a lot of things with. And, there are left-leaning kind of centrist governments. We also voted this year on a couple of key referendum. One was cannabis. The other one was something called the End of Life Choice Bill. So we're essentially going to legalise euthanasia in New Zealand. And obviously in more conservative parts of factions of New Zealand, that is a huge concern. So, there's real opposition to what she's doing. But I guess on the day, the pros outweighed the cons for New Zealanders. Yeah. And I don't know about for you guys, but, this election in particular, and you see it in the United States as well, and New Zealand has been very, very divisive. And I think everyone's just breathing a sigh of relief that it's all finished, to be honest.
Yeah, I think we tend to get like that. Even those of us who love elections, we get to that by the end. Oh, thank goodness it's over, as we head into it there too. Just briefly around this before we do move on, and we'll come back in a couple of moments to talk more about this travel bubble. Um, uh, in terms of the fact that there is now a majority for the Labor Party there, and Jacinda Ardern who heads that up, it has been a little bit unusual for you guys. For us here in Australia, we're used to one party tending to have the majority, but you've actually run coalition governments quite a lot of recent times, haven't you? Where a couple of parties sort of have had to join and said, "All right, well, we'll be the governing area." So this is a little bit unusual for recent history.
Yeah, that's right. So I think since MMP was introduced in New Zealand, we've always had a coalition government. Just what sort of engagement they had is really where it's differed. And the Greens did very well in this election, our sort of environmental party, and got a number of seats. And then another party called the ACT Party in New Zealand also went from one MP in Parliament to 10 MPs in this election. So they've gone from nothing to real influence all of a sudden. They sit more on the right. I think people are kind of split on this issue. It's like, should the government do what they want to do and what they've promised by themselves, or should they bring in minority parties and compromise a little bit? I think from the last 3 years of a Jacinda Ardern-led government in New Zealand, she has used the coalition thing as an excuse for not delivering on a number of things that they would. Well, that was a casualty of MMP. That was a casualty of the coalition, unfortunately. But they would love to have done it. So I think that if they govern alone, they're then accountable and they have to do what they say they're going to do. And that's what New Zealanders expect.
Yeah. Well, there you go. There seems to be plenty of elections and plenty of conversations around that as well. We're going to be back in just a couple of minutes' time chatting to Luke Weston. He is from Rema over in New Zealand. He heads up their content team across their radio networks, doing contemporary Christian radio and TV as well. We're going to be back with him in just a couple of moments' time to talk about the travel bubble and how New Zealanders are looking at it. Obviously, we're looking at it one way. What's it being looked like over in New Zealand? That's on the way next here on 89.9 The Light. On 89.9 The Light, you're in conversation with Clayton Luke Weston is my guest. We're chatting to him from New Zealand. He is the content director at Rema. They've got both their radio stations all across the country, as well as a TV network doing contemporary Christian radio and television. Quite similar, we call it sister stations to us here in Melbourne. Luke, the big news for us has been this travel bubble during this past week, and a lot of conversations, especially here in Victoria, about people coming in when we can't go out and all sorts of things. What has the news of the travel bubble meant for New Zealanders?
Well, personally, it's been fantastic because my mother-in-law lives in Sydney, and she came before the first lockdown in New Zealand to visit and hasn't been able to go until last Friday. She's able to go back to Sydney. So she's been living with us at our house. It's actually been fine. If my wife's watching this, I've loved it. I've loved every second of it.
Absolutely. Exactly right.
No, but, fascinating. I mean, New Zealand's probably not in a position to reciprocate the travel arrangement because essentially we're COVID clear. The only cases that are coming up are ones that are in quarantine at the moment. And, Australia has fared very well. But I guess until you guys are in the same position and it's locked down, that it's not going to be a mutual thing. But certainly for New Zealanders going to Australia, yeah, it's a pretty good deal. I mean, if you're okay to just quarantine if you're coming back.
Yeah. And so what is that? Because those are some questions that have been asked of me, actually, is what is the expectations if you head back to New Zealand? Is it a 2-week quarantine? And how's it working for you?
Yeah, so we 2-week quarantine in a hotel, a government facility, which are just usually hotels. And now you have to pay for it yourself as well. If you make the choice to travel or to come back at this stage, you pay for your own quarantine, which I think has been rolled out in a lot of countries around the world. But certainly that's a big enough deterrent, I think, to stop people heading off on holidays and things like that. So until that lifts, I think New Zealanders are going to be in a similar sort of position.
Yeah. And what's the feeling generally been like around COVID? You know, out of probably every country in the world, it does feel like New Zealand has been the leader around it, and perhaps haven't been hit as hard, or perhaps the great choices that you've made have meant that that's occurred as well. What's it actually been like in terms of mindset? Is it we're just back to normal now, and we're not even really thinking about it? What's sort of the feel?
I mean, I think the first time it reared its head back in March now, isn't it amazing to think how
Yeah.
this year has gone? New Zealanders did go, our Prime Minister, this was her words, go hard and go early. And so we did have a very severe lockdown for 7 weeks when a lot of the rest of the world was just kind of coming to terms with what they were going to do and perhaps jumped on board maybe a little bit too late. So our border was closed down and New Zealanders isolated in what we call a level 4 lockdown, which means basically no outside contact at all. And that really kind of nipped it in the bud. I think we essentially eliminated COVID. Everything that's happened since then has been, on the most part, just in isolation cases of the disease with just one little blip, and that forced us into a 2-week level 3 lockdown. But, I think New Zealanders are now, and this is a sentiment shared by people around the world, I think everyone's over it. Like if something happened and COVID was to rear its head again, I'm not sure whether New Zealanders would be as compliant as they were first time round, and I think it would be a different story. So, and fingers crossed that doesn't happen.
Yeah, and I suppose just an encouragement or a challenge for us. Part of the conversation that's occurred here in Victoria has been, we've gone in July, I think, from 700 cases a day or whatever down to 1 or 2. It's been a absolute severe lockdown. It's been for an extended period of time. Many are sort of in this concept of we've just got to live with this now. Others are saying, no, well, we've worked so hard. Let's really, make sure we complete this off. It's a difficult one, and we're talking about mental health. We're talking about all the economy, all sorts of things as well. Has the general understanding of New Zealanders, and perhaps I'm asking you to think about for everybody, but been it was worth it, or was it, well, actually, you know what, we should have just lived with it a bit more, and the lockdown was never actually worth it?
I mean, first of all, you guys, it's such a different scenario, isn't it? You've got the politics between states in Australia. We don't have any states in New Zealand, so the government's able to just make sweeping moves to lock everybody down, and that's what we did. I think that New Zealanders are on the most part really happy with how it's been handled, and we saw that in the election result last week. I think there is a sentiment that this government has got in based on how they've handled this COVID-19 crisis, basically. Obviously, there's a few conspiracy theories floating around and people that aren't on board. And it's been incredible to see how resilient our economies, and in Australia too, have actually been. I guess there's just that little bit of doubt, how long you can survive and keep your head up above water. And is this thing going to go on into 2021? What is that going to look like? Our governments on both sides of the ditch can't afford to keep on, paying for people's salaries and that sort of stuff. So, I mean, I think there's a lot of unknown, which is making people, not just in New Zealand, but everywhere, pretty fearful about the future.
Yeah. And final question around this before we let you go, Luke, in terms of sort of the economy, obviously the international economy is slightly different for anyone in New Zealand, but the internal economy, are things running pretty much as standard before COVID now? Is the flow of the way you operate, but also the economy and the money and the way it works pretty much standard as before?
I think it depends on the industry. Things like agriculture, dairy prices have been affected for the worse. Obviously, export is very difficult in this current climate. That really affects economies like the New Zealand economy. But then tourism, obviously a huge one for us. But what's been so heartwarming, and I think the same thing's happening in Oz, is just the domestic market really, kicking off. People are seeing things in their own back garden that perhaps they wouldn't have. So there has been a little bit of a boost in those sort of areas. And then some industries have had just massive years. I was talking to a man who owns a caravan company the other day. He said he literally just can't bring caravans in from Europe quick enough. Like, they're just hotcakes at the moment. So it's not all doom and gloom. I think it's just a fear of the unknown. Our economy in actual terms performed 1% better than expected through this last 3 months. Still down, but perhaps a little bit better than was forecast. So, it depends who you speak to, but we'll wait and see.
Yeah. Luke, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time just to give us that perspective of what life is like at the moment over in New Zealand. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Clayton.
Luke Weston, he's the content director at REMA over in New Zealand here on 89.9 The Light.
89.9 The Light. Positive Radio.